Today, I'm going to be talking about one of United States' darkest secrets. And then most of you might know this story, but it's the plot twist right at the very end that everybody will remember. So if that is of interest to you, take a spray can and splash it on the like button's hamburger just right when he's about to put it in his mouth. Let's get right into it. So Chichijima Island is actually an island that is just 500 miles off of Japanese mainland, and during the World War II period, it used to be a very, very important stronghold for that war, for the Japanese during the war. Not only because it was a standalone island, it was one of the biggest standalone island where the military can use as their base. Also because in the island, they actually had two big radio towers mounted on it, which really aided communications within the Japanese military at that point in time during the World War II period. And so it was viewed as a very, very important base for the Japanese during this World War II period. And the United States knew this. The United States knew that this Chichijima Island was very, very important, that whoever controls it had the highest chance of success in the war. And so the United States, they tried as much as possible to take this island away from Japanese, and then Japanese knew that this was going to happen, so they fortified the island with over 25,000 troops, of naval, air, and terrain forces. And so the American military have been strategizing on how to take over this island for a long time, and then they knew that this mission was not going to be easy. They knew it was not going to be an easy mission for them to carry out. And so they kept trying. What they were doing, they were sending fighters to try and bombard the island so that, the Japanese forces can flee. But each time they tried, Japanese just kept repelling their attacks. Like anytime a fighter jet of the United States just hovers close to their island, they just get bombarded by a lot of anti-aircraft guns, and then the mission fails for the United States. So a lot of casualties were suffered, though mainly by Japanese. The Japanese suffered a lot of casualties. The United States too suffered a fair amount of casualties too, because they lost a lot of pilots, they lost a lot of aircrafts and stuff. So the United States decided that instead of trying to take over the island, why don't they just destroy the most important thing in the island, which are those two big radio towers that the Japanese built there for communications across the military. So the United States decided that instead of trying to capture this island, we can take out the communications tower, and then it will actually have a great effect on the war than almost similar to capturing the island, because it's going to be very hard for Japanese to build such radio communications again if it gets destroyed. And so the United States carried out a plan, and then on June 1994, in the morning of June 1994 was the day when they decided to carry on another mission to go and destroy these two radio towers that were in Chichijima Island. And so one of the pilots that they actually enrolled for this mission was 20-year-old George. George was a very, very experienced pilot. Despite his age, he was one of the youngest in the army at that point in time. But despite his young age, he was actually very experienced. He has been to several missions. He's actually been shot down before, and then he's a very, very experienced young pilot. And so in the morning of this mission, George, along with his two crew members, they boarded the plane, Ted and Dale. Ted was the guy in charge of dropping the bomb manually, and Dale was the guy in charge of radio communications. And so when they boarded the plane, they flew along with the other fleet of pilots that were en route for this mission that they were about to go and carry out. And so the way they were going to carry out this mission was actually quite simple, just theoretically simple. The plan was to cruise up to 8,000 feet, which was like the safe distance for anti-aircraft guns. Anti-aircraft guns can't get to 8,000 feet. But in order for them to actually bomb these radio towers, they have to dive down to 3,000 feet so that they can drop bombs on the island. That was what the mission layout looked like. And so George and a couple of other pilots, they boarded their planes and then they went on route to carry on this mission. When George's plane got to Chichijima Island, he began that nose dive to 3,000 feet. But as soon as he dove close to the island, a lot of anti-aircraft guns started firing all over the places, flappers just popping everywhere, trying to take down these planes. Japanese were just relentlessly trying to take down the plane. They kept firing shots at any United States aircraft that they saw on their island. which was normal thing to do, I mean, they were trying to defend their island, so they kept firing a lot of shots. And then as George began that nosedive, while he was climbing down, the left side of his plane actually got hit by one of the anti-aircraft guns. And so now his plane was a little bit unstable, but still stable enough for him to carry on the mission. And so George decided that no matter what, he was going to carry on the mission. And then he kept diving down, and then he got over the 2 radio towers, and then he ordered his crew to drop 2 bombs on the radio towers. And it was actually a direct hit. They had landed 2 500-ton bombs on towers, and then it was a direct hit. And so the mission was successful. So now it was time for George to fly away from the island and go back to the base, to the United States base where he came from. So while he was trying to do that, his plane got hit again. His plane actually got hit again, and then this time around it actually destabilized the plane, and the plane couldn't fly as steady and as stable as it should. So the next best thing for George to do at this point in time was to avoid landing close to the island or in the island by all means possible. So what he did in this situation, because George is an experienced pilot and he's been shot down before, so he knew that the best thing to do in this situation was to actually fly as far away as possible from the enemy camp, to avoid getting captured by all means. That was what he just knew that he had to do. And then after being hit twice by anti-aircraft guns that destabilized his plane, he decided to fly as far away as possible from his island. So just flew the plane far away from the island, and then got to the point where the plane actually couldn't fly very much, couldn't fly as well as it should anymore, because it's been hit twice already, and then it was not going to be very easy to keep it in the air. So the plane actually started diving down, but George was trying his best to just get away from his island. George was actually looking around, seeing other planes that got hit. Most of the pilots were bailing out very quickly. They were bailing out very close to the island without care. They just wanted to get out of their plane so that the planes don't explode or they won't be in the plane when it crashes. So a lot of pilots were ejecting out of their planes very, very early. But George, he still wanted to keep going as far away as possible from his island. And then he was actually the one that managed to fly further away from the island compared to the remaining pilots that got hit. And then when he kept flying and his plane was about to crash, so that was when he now decided to give the order to his crew member Ted and Dale that they should jump down, that they should eject from the plane. So while he was actually about to eject, his head actually hit the side of the aircraft. During the process of him ejecting from the plane, his head actually hit the aircraft, but he managed to eject, and then he was able to launch his parachute so that he would land safely in the ocean. And then while he was landing, he could still look around him, he could still see planes crashing, he could still see pilots bailing out of their plane too early, but he managed to land in the ocean with his parachute open. And then when he landed in the ocean, he got out, trying to, because he was covered by the parachute. Then he kind of struggled a little bit to get the parachute over him so that he can have access to breathe the open air. And then when he managed to successfully do this, he just kept looking around to see whether he can find Ted and Dale. But while he was looking around, he saw that his plane that no longer had a pilot actually fell into the ocean and landed there, because there was no pilot controlling the plane, and then next thing for it to do was to crash. So he crashed into the ocean. He saw the plane crash into the ocean, and then he kept looking around to see whether he can find any sign of his crew members. And then he kept calling out their names, Ted and Dale, looking around for them, but he couldn't find them. He just couldn't find any of his crew members. And then he looked away from himself, and then saw a raft just magically and miraculously appear 10 feet away from where he was in the ocean. So he managed to swim close to the raft, and then he got into the raft, and then he just lay there and he kept swimming as far away as possible from this island while still looking for his crew members. And then while he was actually swimming on top of this raft, he looked back, and then he saw that Japanese military were actually on boats coming towards him, and then he kept swimming away. But at some point he actually gave up, because he knew that there was no way he was going to outswim these boats. The boats and machines are actually obviously faster than him, so there was no way he was going to outswim these boats on the raft that he was. So he kind of just lay there on the raft thinking about his crew member. Like he was just feeling unbelievably guilty that because he was trying to fly away as fast as possible from the island, his crew member may have actually been dead in the crash, because he did not tell them to eject on time. So it was kind of like his fault, because if he had actually told them to eject on time, they probably would have been safe. So he just felt so guilty that their lives may have actually been on his head. So he just lay there, he was thinking about his wife, whether he was actually going to be able to see his wife anymore. He just gave up. He gave up that this is his time to die, because there was obviously no way he was going to outswim these 2 boats that were coming towards him. And so he lay there thinking about everything, thinking about his life, when suddenly, out of nowhere, a troop of United States aircraft just flew into the thing. They flew into the scene, and then they started firing shots at those Japanese boats that were coming at him. And then they just started firing shots at them, and then a lot of bombardments were just happening. And then George, that had already given up, he had already given up. He thought that it was over already. Was suddenly revived with hope, because now people are actually here to save him. And then he kept swimming again once more. He started swimming again, swimming as fast as he could away from this Japanese island that he had just managed to fly successfully from. He kept swimming away and swimming and swimming and swimming. And then he actually swam for like 2 hours. At this point, he was unbelievably exhausted. Was actually very exhausted, because swimming in the ocean for 2 hours is going to be exhausting for anybody. And so he just got tired of swimming, and he just lay there, just kind of waiting for the United States aircraft that was bombarding the boats to come back and rescue him. So he just lay there. He had already given up. He was very, very exhausted at this point. And then he just turned around. He could hear like some rumbles in the water. Could hear some rumbles coming from under where he was staying. So he looked, and then he saw the periscope of a United States submarine coming out of the ocean. And then his hope also just got rekindled again. After like 10 minutes, he got rescued by the crew of the submarine that just came out of the ocean. And then he was actually safe. He did not die. He was able to get rescued along with some other pilots that the aircraft people were able to save. So some of the pilots that built too early close to the Japanese island, the United States were not able to rescue them because they thought they were dead or captured. They thought that they were dead. So the United States wasn't able to rescue them. George was like amongst the few survivors of that assault. But the thing is that United States, even if they initially did not know that those other pilots may be alive, they actually later found out pretty quickly what happened to those other pilots that they were not able to rescue. Let's find out whatever happened to them. And then decided that whatever happened to them has to stay secret because of the gruesome nature of what the Japanese did to those prisoners. So they decided to keep it secret, decided to keep a seal on it, because they figured that if they actually let the families of these pilots know about what happened to them, they're going to be incredibly traumatized. So they decided to keep it secretive. And then nobody actually knew what happened there until 2004, when an author named James Bradley discovered the transcript of a war crimes trial that happened. So the author of James Bradley actually discovered the transcript of a war crimes trial that was held in Guam. So that's how the whole world got to know about the secrets of what happened there. And so what I'm about to tell you next is actually the account of what happened to those captured pilots that built too quickly and landed too close to the island that were captured by Japanese people. This was actually what happened to them. So like after 24 hours of being captured by the Japanese military, they captured 7 pilots alive. 7 young pilots were captured alive. The 7 of them were taken back to the Japanese military camp as prisoners of war, where they were stripped of their military gear and then just left outside. They just left them outside to dry in the middle of the Japanese camp. And so there's actually a very notorious general that was around when this whole thing was happening. His name is Yoshio Takibana. He's a 60-year-old alcoholic that is very, very notorious for his sadistic tendencies towards prisoners of war. He likes to just do a lot of inhuman things to prisoners of war. And so he was around on the day when this whole assault happened. So when he was presented to the 7 prisoners, when he was brought to see the 7 prisoners that got captured, he actually ordered that one of them be tied to a stake, a wooden stake that was in the middle of the Japanese camp. He ordered that one of them be tied to a wooden stake and beaten by all the Japanese soldiers. He just ordered them to beat him up while he was tied on the stake. Prisoner that actually took and tied to the stake was actually Marv Marchand. He's a 20-year-old from California. He's a 20-year-old military pilot from California, and then he was tied to a tree and then beaten for the whole day basically. And then on the evening of that day, Yoshio Takibana actually went there to untie Marv by himself. He untied Marv, and then they took him to the jungle in the night, and then they walked him towards a shallow grave that they had dug already. They walked him towards the grave, and then they told him to sit down, and then when he sat down, they gave him a cigarette to smoke. So they were just giving him his last cigarette at this point in time. And then after he finished smoking the last cigarette, he was ordered to march towards a Japanese soldier that was holding a katana. And then when he marched towards the soldier that was holding the katana, he was ordered to stretch for his head. And then when he did, he actually got beheaded, and then they buried his body in that shallow dog grave, and then they left his body there. So Tagivana is actually a very psychotic human being that, he just has a lot of crazy tendencies. He has a lot of just sick things in his mind. And then he was talking to his generals. So while he was talking to his generals, he was telling them that he wants to know whichever of them can prove to him that they have the fighting spirit. He was trying to get them to prove to him that they have the fighting spirit. And then the way for them to prove that they have fighting spirit was actually to eat human flesh. And so he actually ordered some soldiers to go back to where they buried Marv's body to unearth it and then cut off his thigh. And so the soldiers went there and then unearthed his body. It was actually like maybe 12 hours after Marv's body was buried. That's when he ordered them to go and unearth his body. And so when he did, he told them to cut off his thigh and then take it to the chef so that they can make a meal out of it, which is what they actually did. And so they took off Marv's thigh from his dead body and then took it to the chef, and then they made a meal out of it, and then they served it to the generals and then a couple soldiers, the high executives in the camp, and then some generals and then some soldiers too. So the people that actually ate this human flesh, they thought it was very, very good. They thought it tasted very, very good with sake. So they enjoyed the meal, and then they enjoyed it so much that Tachibana had to order the soldiers to go and take more flesh from Marv's dead body, which he actually did. So they went to the grave again, dug it out, and then took more flesh and then brought it to the chef and then prepared it into meals, which they gave the higher executives in the camp. So they literally ate Marv's body. So like after a month of initially eating a dead prisoner in the Japanese camp, the 6 other prisoners were still alive. So Tagivana was visiting the same camp. When he got to the island, he went to check on the prisoners, and then he saw that there were still 6 other prisoners remaining. So he ordered them to take one of the prisoners again and tie him to a tree so that the soldiers can practice their bayonet war on the prisoner that they took. And then the prisoner they took was actually 25 years old Floyd Hall from Missouri. So he told them to tie him to a tree. They plunged their bayonet into his chest and his stomach until he eventually died. And then when he died, the general ordered surgeons to come and surgically remove his organs, being his liver and his gallbladder. And then when they removed those organs, they wrapped it in preservative paper to keep it fresh. And then he also told them to take off flesh from his body and make it into meals, which was what they did. So after gruesomely killing him with multiple bayonet plunges, he actually ordered them to cut off his organs, and then he also ordered them to take flesh from his body and then prepare it into meals, which was actually what they did. So that's how they killed Floyd Hall. And while this whole gruesome process was happening, the other 5 remaining prisoners were watching this happen to one of them. Like this whole thing was happening in front of them. The plunging of bayonets, the harvesting of the organs was happening right in front of these 5 remaining alive prisoners, was happening in front of them. And so after they removed Floyd Hall, he ordered them to take the next soldier and then do the same thing to him, but he would not accept. The name of prisoner that they actually took was A.O. Vaughn. The name was A.O. Vaughn. He's a 22-year-old from Texas. That's the guy they took. And then he struggled so much that he did not allow them time to that stick that they tied the previous prisoner to. He just struggled so hard, prevented them from tying to the stick as much as possible. He kept fighting. He didn't want to experience the gruesome thing that he had just witnessed, so he just kept struggling and then stretching out his neck, telling them to behead him. He put up so much fight that eventually they actually had to give in. And then one of the soldiers put his head down and then eventually beheaded him. And then when they beheaded him, the surgeons came and then they harvested some organs and then cut off part of his body and made it into a meal. So now it's remaining 4 prisoners because 3 have been killed and made into meals. So out of the remaining 4 prisoners, 3 of them suffered the same fate until 1 was left. But this was actually over a 2-month period. After killing Floyd and Elvon, they killed 3 prisoners on this day. So it was remaining 3. So the remaining 3 prisoners were kept. So after like 2 months of that thing happening, he came back to the base again, and then they killed 2 of the remaining 3 prisoners in the same fashion. But the last prisoner actually died in a more gruesome and inhuman way. Instead of actually killing him, what he ordered them to do was to just take meat from his body. They just kept harvesting part of his body while he was alive. The main purpose of doing this was to make their meat fresh. That's what the whole idea of keeping him alive while harvesting his body organs was. So they just kept amputating the last prisoner until there was nothing more on his body to amputate. So they amputated him, and then he eventually died. It was just a very, very inhumane thing to do. And so eventually, during this war crime, they found Yoshio Takebana and like 60 other executives guilty, and then they were sentenced to death. They were actually sentenced to death. But other soldiers that were related in it, that knew about it and didn't say anything, soldiers that just knew about it or participated in it halfway, they were all sentenced to like 8 years in prison. But Yoshio Takebana and the other top executives were sentenced to death by hanging. And then the United States knew about this. They knew about this. That's why they took it to the war crimes court, and then the trial was held. That's how the whole punishment things were served. So one thing we can say about George is that, having survived from the gruesomeness of what happened to these captured prisoners, he did not waste the second chance at life, because George would go on to become the 41st president of the United States, George H.W. Bush, and then his son too became the next president after him, George W. Bush again. So he did not waste his chance at life. He actually turned out to be one of the greatest presidents in United States history, having barely survived from getting eaten alive. We can all agree that he did not waste second chance at life. And so this story is one of the biggest secrets in United States, if not until when this author discovered these transcripts, nobody would have known about it. I guess George never talked about it too. And so with that, we have come to the end of this episode. If you got something from this story, be sure to drop it in the comments. Also like and subscribe to this channel to support. It's gonna go a long way. It's gonna go along for the channel, and then we're going to see you in next episode. Make sure you have a great day.